Tabletops will start after the following messages.
Are you looking for something comfortable to wear and keep your brain warm while playing tabletop games? Daily Dose of Yarn makes handmade, customized beanies for all of your style and comfort needs. She can even help you with a custom beanie to represent your favorite character. Check out Daily Dose of Yarn on Instagram and Etsy to order your new favorite beanie today.
The world is electric with psychic energy, an interconnected web of memory and emotional echoes that only animals are able to perceive. Nowhere is that energy more powerfully present than in human trash. Psychic Trash Detectives is the first release from Scripted Games. In this collaborative tabletop role-playing game, players create their own psychic trash animals like raccoons and possums. They mine trash for psychic clues to solve a mystery plaguing their animal community. It is a game that absolutely reeks of radical self-acceptance and punk camaraderie. You can pledge Psychic Trash Detectives now on Kickstarter. Live fast, touch trash, solve mysteries.
Hey cool people, do you like mead, magic, and long walks in the icy tundra? Ever wonder what your sled dogs are thinking about? Why not cap off your night with a frosty tabletop adventure?
You will come to love my beef cliff.
You're at the common room. Go to your room.
Excuse us.
Excuse me, Dolcliffe. What's your favorite food?
Sausages, probably.
No, you look like a strong lot, but I've got more friends than you.
Carnelian's like short and on the ground, and he's standing on
You
top
know
of the table.
what you have to
Did
do.
you know what you have to do? Carnelian stabs him in the butt.
What did he say?
He likes sausages.
Oh my god, me too.
Alright, I'll sit beside Word and start carving his rod.
Oh my god. Sveta, my rod's nearing completion by the looks of things.
Unless the four of you can stop them.
Well, grab your Ugg boots and join Reflex Save every Wednesday on your favorite podcast platform.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Tabletop. Today we have a really great interview with Ferne Milton, lead designer of Cobblepath Games, creator of Locust, and the award-winning Stacks of Goblins. It's a really great interview. I think you're going to like it. But before we get into the interview, I wanted to let you know of a new update in Tabletop world. Tabletop is actually joining the Helios Network, which you may have heard around. It is a podcast network for normal people and full of podcasts made by normal people. We are so excited to be joining them. They have some really, really great shows like Banter and Such and Master and Debaters, I'll Be Careful and You'll Be Dead. And they even have some TTRPG content already on the network, like Swords and Unicorns, which is a family-friendly TTRPG actual play, which is really, really fun. Anyway, nothing really should change. You're going to hear us talk about some of the other shows on the network a little more. And if you already listen to other Helios Network shows, you're probably going to hear some of the Tabletop crew on those episodes and their ads and things like that. So we're really happy to be part of the family. Thank you everyone at the Helios Network for inviting us. We're so happy to join. And everyone else, I hope you enjoy this wonderful interview with Ferne Milton. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Tabletop. Today, I have an incredible interview for you, and I am so excited to interview Ferne Milton. It is such a pleasure. She is an Emmy award-winning game designer and artist. You may have heard of the games she had a hand in, including Locust, Stacks of Goblins, and an upcoming game, Coffee and Chaos, which we will talk about a little bit later. Ferne, welcome to Tabletop.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, of course. I kind of want to start out from your biography because you used to teach game design and game development, and then you eventually left that to kind of do it yourself. So can you tell me a little bit about that decision, what prompted it, how you decided you were ready to move in that direction? Because I know a ton of people who love TTRPGs, RPGs, games in general, and want to move into a space where they are producing those, getting them out into the world, and are just sort of befuddled by the process of that. So I'd love to start there and kind of get your thoughts on that.
So I will gloss over my reasons for primarily it was that the British education system sucks. And the reason why I got out and then went into tabletop RPGs was basically because I left. I worked out my notice period, and then I was like, okay, I'll have a month off, and then I will start looking for a new career. And I was in graphic design. I was looking at something visual because that's where my degrees are in. So I was like, okay, yeah, graphic design seems like a sensible thing. And then 2 weeks into that month, lockdowns and COVID, right now, that's not about to happen, is it? So me and Stay of a Half Cobblepath, we were gearing up to do the Kickstarter to get Locus. We already released it as a desperately in need of an edit the previous December. But we were gearing up with the idea that we'll do a Kickstarter. Hopefully we can get it printed professionally if the Kickstarter succeeds. If it doesn't, no harm, no foul. We've still got the game we've made. We're still pretty proud of it, etc. And then when I realised I wasn't going to be making a big career move anytime soon, I just sort of thought, maybe we should actually take this Kickstarter a bit more serious, not sort of like just wing it. And we hired a Kickstarter consultant, and I like social media marketing and all that sort of stuff. And then the Kickstarter was fortunately a big success. It's just over 200% of the goal. We went to UK Games Expo the year after, and this has kind of become my full-time job now. So yeah, my experience up until Twitter essentially was basically me and my friends and a couple of other people that I'd known at sort of like game shops and stuff. But the breadth of RPGs I played was pretty limited. It was basically World of Darkness RPGs, a couple of sessions of D&D, and like I played Paranoia, and I played Cyberpunk, and I'd read a couple of the other bigger ones.
Sure.
And then like sort of coming onto Twitter and being like, oh, there's a lot of people making things, and most of them are incredibly cool.
I feel you. I mean, like it is crazy how dominated the market is by like a few select games they're all quite good and they're all fun to play, but there are the total breadth of the TTRPG space, especially the indie space. There's so many weird, cool things that are just really amazing and fun to play. It just completely boggles my mind when I hear somebody who has like never even heard of one of the bigger indie ones, which is like Powered by the Apocalypse System games. Is like, man, you're so this is so exciting for you. Let me tell you about these other games.
Yeah, it's the frustrating thing as an indie developer, which I think often gets misconstrued, but for me at least, the frustrating thing has always been the lack of the concept that there are different games for different purposes. And that's really is kind of like very affected by the market more than anything else. Obviously, there's the monolith that is Dungeons and Dragons, but even beyond that, the vast majority of the big games are very combat centric. And you know, the idea that you would want to play a sort of like, I don't know, trading based game that's more about sort of like social interactions and market manipulation and things. The idea that you wouldn't use a game that still has combat as its main thing is really frustratingly foreign to a lot of people because of the landscape of the market. And it's the thing that I would like to see change a little bit more. And it's not like...
Yeah, it's interesting because in the board game space, you have a huge amount of development where each game has like micro categories, like this is an engine builder game and people who want to have that experience will go there, and this is a resource management game or a token placement game or an army management game or whatever. There's so many different like micro genres within the board game market that I'm really surprised that sort of mentality hasn't shifted over to the TTRPG market yet, because they are so they're like within the same family of hobbies, I guess.
Yeah, well, I think it's that there isn't the culture around that existing.
Yeah.
Which is odd because it used to.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a historian about the space, so I'm really not the person to be talking about, the exactities of it. But it used to be the case that there were a lot more games that were considered big games, that were like more on an even keel with each other. And the thing is a lot of them are still around, like Call of Cthulhu and the World of Darkness games, which now Chronicles of Darkness, but they're now kind of like second, like B tier games, whereas it used to be that there were a lot of A tier games, as I understand it. And a lot of them served very different ideas and concepts, but there's a lot of muddiness around the idea that one game can do anything.
Mm-hmm. And they're really not built that way. And I kind of want to talk about Locus and your idea that you have on your website that you're super passionate about, around you saying that games should have mechanics that directly correspond to and affect the gameplay experience that someone is supposed to be getting out of it. And I was recently at a convention, and I was listening to a whole talk on mechanics, and they were saying how in Dungeons and Dragons, for example, the one main mechanic that it has is roll a d20 and then yes, no binary comes out of that. Like, do you do the thing?
Yeah.
So I would love to get because Locus, when I was giving it a look through, I'm so excited to play it. But I was giving it a look, and it just seems like there is such a really careful eye on character building, the flaws that you put in there. It all is built to create a very specific type of gameplay and experience. I just kind of want to hear how you think about these mechanics and what you try to get out of them when you're developing them.
Yeah, sure. So part of it comes from the fact that we're small.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to try and make anything that's directly taking on one of the bigger games.
Sure.
Though I say that, I'm a little bit hypocritical, because actually one of the main catalysts for us making Locus originally was that we didn't find Call of Cthulhu scary.
Yeah.
And that's not a Call of Cthulhu bad game. It's we have particular tastes in horror.
Sure.
And we didn't see them represented in games that we were aware of, which, as I mentioned earlier, was a pretty tiny selection of games. There's a lot of really good indie horror TTRPGs out there. But we wanted to make something that would scare us.
Mm-hmm.
Because me and Steph are both into horror movies, but we're also really picky.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of stuff that we don't find particularly scary. And there's a very sort of like specific vibe to horror. And that's kind of what really energized Locus as a project. So one of the things that we developed during making Locus, about 3 years in actually, and this used to be something that I used to teach my students, was define your goals. Because when we first started Locus, we kind of had some ideas and we threw them on the page and we started building stuff. And about half of what we made in those first 3 years then got thrown out at one point, because we sat down and after a few play tests, just things recurringly hadn't been working. We were like, what do we do? Things are not working. And a lot of the difficulties had been that I was really attached to a couple of mechanics we made. Did not want to throw them out, which is a very common game dev problem. In particular, new game dev problem. So to overcome that, what we ended up doing was taking a step back and going, what do we want this game to do?
Yeah.
What are we making it for? What are the purposes of the game? And once we did that, we had a sort of guiding light for our decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And it really helped us make our decisions when they were tough, because it gave us a metric to ask where we could go, okay, this thing kind of isn't working. Do we want to change it, or does it need to stay? And the question was always, is it meeting any of the system goals?
And so when you say system goals, are you going off of, so in this case it was horror, were you going off of genre like feeling? Like for me, when I watch or try to engage with horror content, the big thing that feels to me, the thing that especially interactive fiction, when you're trying to inspire fear in a player, you give them a sense of powerlessness and things like that. So did you like take horror, distill down what you guys found to be the most interesting parts of it, and then create interactive ways to cause those specific feelings? Or was it more the like serving the purpose of, I am trying to develop a certain type of gameplay that was happening?
So meta answer to that question depends on the game you're making. I'll go through in a little bit what our goals were for the different games we made.
Sure.
Sometimes it's very experiential. Sometimes it's, I wanted to use this mechanic. Sometimes it's, I wanted to encapsulate this feeling.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's, I want it to be cooperative. For Locus, the ones we eventually settled on were, it has to be scary.
Yep.
That was really our primary thing, was we wanted a horror game that was scary.
Mm-hmm.
For us, at least. Obviously very subjective, but it was based around a place, because early on we decided that Locus was going to be based around evil places, where the place you were in was the monster.
Yeah.
For a number of reasons, partly because it's an ongoing horror trope we weren't aware of in the space, at least not in the major games. The second thing was, it's an ongoing horror trope that spawned a lot of things that we personally found quite scary, movie-wise and game-wise. And the other one was, we just thought we could do something interesting with it, and we thought it was a good differentiator as well, and a sort of like solid thematic point to explain the game. And the other one was that it would be based on characters and on personal characters, and react to that it would be about consequences.
Yeah.
And those are really vague, but they were still a sort of like beacon for us to aim for. And
yeah, so it at least gave you like a direction that you could always cross-reference with what you were working on to say, does this serve these? Even if they're vague, they are directional, sort of like a compass, so that you can be like, are we pointing towards these points?
One of the big mechanics we threw out was, it still has cards, but originally the cards were used to augment dice rolls. So you added the card number onto the dice roll, and they're like stronger monsters. You needed big cards to actually even hurt, and you gained cards by indulging in the bad parts of your character, and it became this really heavy resource management, almost card game style thing, and it just pulled away from everything we wanted it to do. And that got thrown out wholesale. But things like the character stats being negative rather than positive, that was a really early addition that aligned with our goals for the whole project. So
can you talk a little bit more about that too? Because it is very interesting to me that most of the time when you're building a character in a game like this, you are building what they can do. And with these character sheets in Locus, it is very much, these are your character's failings, faults, and fears, essentially.
Yeah.
And that completely changes how someone thinks about their character, how they move through a game. So like, can you talk a little bit about designing that and what it is that you were trying to get to by doing it?
Yeah, so the thing that animated that as a mechanic was basically us looking at horror movie protagonists and characters, and coming to the conclusion that in aggregate, in that setting, in that genre, horror characters don't succeed because of what they're good at.
Yeah.
They fail because of what they're bad at. And the people that succeed in horror just manage to overcome their failings more effectively.
Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting. That's like such a different way to look at both, you know, storytelling in general, but also as a game designer, that completely changes everything you do, essentially.
Yeah. It's kind of wild how much it does. And I've had some slightly heated conversations with people before about the idea that mechanics don't matter because it's about how you frame them.
Oh, I mean, this is the entirety of that lecture that I attended at PAX Unplugged. The guy who was giving the lecture was essentially like, there's only one mechanic in D&D, and if you ask anyone what their favorite thing about D&D is, it is not the mechanics. Yeah. They're like, when you ask somebody, they're like, oh, I have this boyfriend, he has a spiky mohawk, and he's really exciting to be around, and we have such a cool dynamic, and I really love playing my character with these interactions. It's like, none of those are mechanics.
I stand by the fact that the vast majority of things that people say they really like about D&D are just aspects of tabletop RPGs in general, not D&D. But my response is, mechanics really do matter, but framing is also part of mechanics.
Yeah.
Because functionally in Locus, the stats that you have are no different to if we called them positive and just kind of reversed the dice roll. They would function the same. The probabilities would be the same. The way you interact with it on a purely mechanical basis would be the same.
Yeah.
But the framing's important to how you, like, emotionally connect to those mechanics. The fact that you go into character building thinking about what your character is bad at does prime you for a horror game, which where a genre is really quite heavily and commonly about the failings of people. And especially in ours, which is, you know, intrinsically about the failings of people.
Yeah.
That is the core kind of theme about Locus, is about failings and overcoming them, and guilt and regret for your past transgressions. So it's important that that sets it up.
Yeah. And what?
But there's this really interesting muddy line there that I find fascinating.
Yeah, one thing that this kind of gets me thinking about too, especially when it comes to a horror genre, but really any genre in any sort of game, the invisible hand of the designer is in everything that you're doing. It is directing how you play. It's directing what kind of stories are being told, just by the fact that as a designer, you're kind of creating the means in which the story is being told and the game is being played. So when you're doing, in this case, a horror game, and you're trying to create that experience in those stories, how do you remove the player's awareness that they are being directed in that way, I guess? So the best times that I've had in a TTRPG, it really is a seamless connection between the story, the mechanics, and how the game is played. It's like, it just feels like everything is just tumbling out, and it just happens, and it's fun, and everything kind of just works. So when you're kind of designing Locus, and when in that, how did you guys sort of take yourselves out of the game enough that people aren't like, okay, these are my stats, let me look at my inventory, let me do this, how am I going to interact with this? Because this sheet tells me to do these things. Like, how did you make it so that it just became more natural for people to get the experience that they were getting out of the mechanics you built?
That's a really interesting question. I don't have an answer for the whole of the system.
Sure. I know it's a huge question, but even just like a little bit, because it's just always been interesting me how that kind of interfacing between the person who is playing and the designer who is not at the table but is definitely a part of the experience, how that interface works, you know?
Yeah, no, I think it's an absolutely amazing question. It's also one that I've not been asked before. So it's very much Yes, good question. How does that work? How did we overcome that? So, a lot of it boils down to you want to keep the mechanics out of the way so that they aren't a blockade to the experience.
Yeah.
And that can mean a whole lot of different things in different contexts, annoyingly. But some examples are, a big one is kind of trying to take the mental load off of players and off of the director. One of the things that we ended up doing in Locus a lot of the stuff that we pared down during its development was about making sure that the director didn't have like 40 things to track. Because certain versions of the game absolutely were asking way too much of the director.
Yeah.
But a lot of it's like take the mental load off, and there's a few ways that works. One of the big ones I think can be really hit and miss in different games is having the mechanics make sense narratively. Some games do not adequately explain what a dice roll is.
Yes.
What are you actually doing when you roll the dice? What does that represent? And then other ones that will give you like sort of points to spend and things, but don't adequately really explain what that means, what the fiction around that mechanic is. And when you don't understand how mechanics fit into the fiction you're writing, it creates sometimes only a tiny wall, but any wall will pull you out of it a little bit.
I'll be honest, Fern, you just kind of blew my mind a little bit. Like, that is such an interesting way to say that, like the fiction of the mechanics, because I'm, again, just defaulting to the games I've played before, Powered by the Apocalypse, D&D, all those things. Especially when it comes to D&D, when you roll, what that mechanic originally was a 5% chance of success. And so when you're rolling, a 1 is a automatic failure, but technically it's a 5% chance that you succeeded all the way up to 100%. But then when you look at the mechanics these days, after all the additions have kind of built upon each other, people are rolling like 27s and they're doing crazy stuff. And so the fiction of the mechanic has completely separated itself, and the action of rolling a dice is a purely player thing rather than a character thing. That's a really interesting way of looking at that.
There's also the fact that, to use D&D as an example, I think that single D20 is a really naff mechanic, just in general. For a number of reasons. The only game I've seen do it well is Mutants and Masterminds, and that's because it uses the variance of the D20 to kind of highlight the range of power that different superheroes can have. Because you can have like plus 20 on the skill. And 15 is like your success threshold. So if like, Superman just does not worry about strength rolls, because he has 20 before he touches the dice.
Right.
Like, so they've done a good job in that particular game of like, because it builds into the scaling of the characters. But like, what is the dice roll in D&D? Is it like luck? Is it your character messing up? Is it a reflection of your character's skill level? And if it's a reflection of your character's skill level, why does it fluctuate so much? And the thing is that ultimately it doesn't really adequately answer that question. But it's only one dice, so whatever, roll the dice. And it doesn't get in the way too much because it's a very simple dice roll. But there are other examples, like I've seen other games where, and honestly, like most of the time I run into this, it's in early betas of my own games. If I'm honest, is where I will come up with something, I'm like, that's really cool. And then I'm like, but what is it? What actually is happening there? Why is that happening? What does that mean in universe? And it really does create a disconnect, I found, and it gets in the way. If you don't know what it's doing, like one of the things in Locus is everything you do has a difficulty. So rolls are either easy, medium, or hard. And the easy, medium, or hard distinctly is an element of the the thing you're trying to do. It has nothing to do with the character doing it. If your character is really good at something, that doesn't change that action from being hard.
Yeah.
So you know that the dice that you roll, compared to your stats, they are about how your character manages to do this thing, how they manage to deal with this circumstance. But the circumstance itself is unrelated to the characters, and that's clear, which makes it a lot easier to kind of engage with stuff. Some other examples to kind of like move on from massive, sprawling meta-analyses of dice roll. Some other stuff in Locus is that Locus is not designed as a game where you can pick and choose what you do.
Yeah.
Like, if you have a character who has low frailty, so they're very strong, and they're good at doing physical acts, you don't get to choose to always do physical acts in Locus. You don't get to make that decision a lot of the time. The world and the director make that decision for you. And that means that rather than having a character with a specialty who engages with the problems they're good at, you've got a character where you feel your failings.
Yeah, you are experiencing the weakness and the powerlessness of being confronted with something that you are unprepared for, which is, in essence, what the horror movie genre it puts its characters through all the time.
And it both ties in with the horror, but it also, to link it back to your question, it makes it so that the numbers on the sheet, on the character sheet, are reactive. You don't go through Locus thinking, like spending your time going, okay, I'm really good at strength, so I should find a strength solution to this. You go, I need to do this thing, or the group needs to do that thing. Am I actually any good at it?
Yeah, that's such a cool way to look at it too, because one of my favorite TTRPGs is Monster of the Week by Mike Sands, and when he was building out that, he uses the Powered by the Apocalypse dice system as its base, and he sort of made it into a thing where you have characters that are strong at some things and weak at others, but the way that the game forces you to do stuff, you are never choosing to roll. You are always asked to be basically asked to make a roll by the keeper in specific situations that you are narratively telling. So if you like, I bust into the house and I say, everybody don't eat this food or whatever, then the keeper can say, okay, roll a persuade, like a charm check essentially. And you have to persuade somebody, and then you roll your dice, and then you find out, oh, my monstrous character sucks at conversing with people. And so it kind of does a similar way too. And I think that that's one of the reasons why I've never felt the same block as I have with some other systems, which are much more active, pick and choose what you're doing from time to time, and you're activating certain things on your character sheet as a player rather than as a director or a keeper or a DM. So yeah, I think that reactive gameplay is just way better for interactive fiction in general, because it allows a character to feel like a player to feel like they are moving through a story, and then they hit somewhere where they're like, okay, now I have to see whether or not the story allows me to do this. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I slightly disagree in that I don't necessarily think that it is better for interactive active fiction per se.
Okay.
But I do think that it's better for certain types of stories. And I think that it's a good way to look at doing stories that aren't just about teams of people fighting stuff.
Yeah, I guess you're right, because there are certain types of stories that you tell that are much more logistical, and that is a huge part of the game itself. And so being in that mind space as a player, and this goes back to what you're saying about mechanics being part of the fiction and whether they're tied successfully or not to them. So yeah, I guess you're right that it is really depends. And this goes back to our original talk a little bit about the kind of micro genres within the TTRPG and the board game space, that there is space for all of these different types of play. They just don't always all work for each other's spaces.
Yeah. I mean, like, for example, like Cyberpunk is
Mm-hmm.
like a lot of the core of the gameplay of Cyberpunk is going on missions, and a lot of that is about like, okay, how do we go on this mission? What are the skill sets we have in the crew? What can we do here? What's the plan? And that doesn't really work if you don't, if you're forcing people to just react to stuff, especially in a system like Cyberpunk, where honestly, if you get made to do a lot of things that your character's no good at, they're probably dead because it's quite lethal. Like if you're being forced to shoot a gun to succeed at a scene, and your character isn't spec'd for gun shooting, you're not hitting that person. You're not in Cyberpunk. And certain games do that really well, certain other games don't. I mean, the one that keeps coming back to me is Nova from Spencer Campbell, which is very much it's outright supposed to be a kind of like low stakes combat game, where the idea is it's about telling cool combat scenarios. It's not really about worrying whether your character will make it through this combat. It's about being in mechs and doing really rad stuff.
Yeah.
And that's very much like you have a class and all the classes have different types of mechanics and they play different roles in a fight and stuff. And it's really cool. Like, I love Nova. I think it's rad as hell. But it's a very different game to, like, Locus, for example. Quite suitably so, because if you want to play a combat mech game, don't use Locus. It would be awful for it. Like, you technically could, but don't.
Yeah, right. It's like this, we're giving you the ability to use this rule system however you want, but please, please, please don't use it in this way.
It's a tabletop RPG. You can use it for whatever you want. It's kind of inherent to the medium. I can't stop you. But I will tell you it's a bad idea. You want to play a combat mech game? Buy Nova or Lancer. Get those.
So
I don't know Lancer very at all, but I've heard it's good. But I know that's a recommendation from me. People who want a combat mech game. If you want to tell a really scary horror story, look at Locus, because I think it's pretty good for that.
So kind of going on that line as well, I had a talk with one of my good friends who brought up the fact that as a culture, a lot of stories that happen these days really center around violence being a conflict resolution mechanism, and this kind of is in a lot of TTRPGs as well. Can you talk a little bit about how you approach that? Because combat is in horror, but usually it is done in a sort of it's a delay tactic, or it is a thing that people do when they have no other choice. It's not all right, we rush into the mob of monsters and try to clear these things out. You know what I mean? So when you approach the idea of combat as a conflict resolution mechanism and its place in this game, how did you kind of think about that?
So me and Steph have an interesting relationship with combat. With Locus, partly because when we started making Locus, it was to the backdrop of horror video games kind of happening again, because there was after the PS2 era, basically horror games stopped being made for like a decade.
Yeah, and all the ones that were made were like Fear or something, where it was jump scares and a lot of gunplay.
It was not a scary game. I liked it, but it was not a scary game. It established in the second level that the main bad guy, who was like the horror part of it, wasn't going to kill you. Yeah. Because it basically went, look, she's all powerful, and you're not dead right now. And I went, cool, you're not dead. Like, she can literally turn a guy into a puddle of mush and a skeleton. And I'm still standing here.
I am invincible.
Like, she's not coming after me.
Right.
But it was, like you had like kind of a few horror flavored games, but there weren't really any horror games. And then Amnesia happened. And Amnesia was good.
Yeah.
But it spawned this plague of non-combat walking horror games.
Yeah.
None of which seemed to get why Amnesia worked.
Mm-hmm.
And we kind of started making Locus to the backdrop of being kind of frustrated at this trend in video games.
Yeah.
Because Amnesia works because it's got like this really complex and well, it's not that complex, but it's got this interesting push and pull between two resources at all times, where basically every action you can take in that game jeopardizes sanity for health, or the other way around.
Yeah.
And that makes it compelling. And then all these other games were just kind of like, oh, it's just a haunted house, there'll be a jump scare, or enemy might grab you out of the closet. Like, that's great. It's fucking, I don't care.
Yeah.
I really don't think Outlast is a good game. I'm sorry for the people who like it. But yeah, so we made Locus with that in mind. So from the off, combat was in Locus. All of the scariest games that we know, video games wise, have combat in them.
Mm-hmm.
However, one of the big things we wanted to do with Locus, which we tried to build into the mechanics and hopefully we achieved, we didn't want combat to be the first option and we didn't want it to be the only option. So we ended up settling on the idea of, broadly speaking, the reaction to a monster is run, fight, or hide.
Yeah.
Those are, generally speaking, going to cover basically everything you're doing with a monster. And the idea is that they all work the same, was one of the ways we made it. So we put combat in, and then we de-incentivized it.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the ways we did that was by making it work exactly the same as the other two reactions you can have to a monster. They all work in the same core system, basically.
So you weren't really rewarding it over some of the other ways you could deal with these situations. You were saying these are all even in how good they are to take as a character in this bad situation. So you're not incentivizing, kill the thing over run and hide or whatever it was.
Yeah, but also we weren't. We were avoiding having combat be like its own chunk of the game. Because in most TRPGs, to be fair, that have combat, but especially because combat is pretty prevalent in like most big tabletop RPGs, they tend to be centered around combat.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're doing that, combat kind of tends to become its own thing. Like, enter combat, you're in a slightly different time space often. Very often, the dice kind of react differently to the game in combat. You often have skills that only really make sense in combat and don't do anything outside of it. There's basically like a whole chunk of the game that is essentially segregated in most games. And one of the things we wanted to do in Locus was kind of pull that back a bit.
Mm-hmm.
There is conflict, and conflict has different rounds, and it changes the way the time interacts, and it changes the way you interact, and there's initiative and things like that. So we didn't completely remove that kind of different space. But within it, we didn't have like 40 rules for how to hurt things, and then one rule for running and one rule for hiding.
You gave each of them the attention to flesh them out so that they all felt viable and real and a way to interact with the game.
Yeah, we basically, functionally, we tried to balance them. We tried to have them all be roughly the same, and also be similar to engage with from a player point of view. And that's kind of difficult to explain, but like in most,
I think that I get some of that too, because like one thing that I'm super frustrated with certain TTRPGs is that the narrator's voice is very powerful, and if you as a GM say there is this dangerous thing that is here, a lot of the reaction to that is that people are like, I want to engage with it. I want to like touch it. I want to fight it. I want to whatever it is, because the narrator has pointed out that this thing is in this setting an extraordinary variable that you can have. Essentially, you can have a part in interacting with. And so it becomes very tough when you're trying to say, this is the world. There's this really dangerous thing that nobody really should touch, but I want to point it out because it's there. And what you guys should be doing is a variety of other things. A lot of people will default to, okay, let's all push a big rock on it and start fighting it.
Yeah, and that is an intrinsic problem with the medium.
Yeah.
I mean, the reality is that if something is there, if it's been pointed out by the GM, it's important.
Yeah.
Right? Like, because otherwise they wouldn't have mentioned it.
Yep, exactly.
If a character was to walk into my room, you would not explain to them, like, the array of LARP weapons I've got next to a stack of board games, and you wouldn't like mention probably the USB sticks on the top of my computer unless those USB sticks were plot important.
Yeah.
And you just can't go into the amount of detail that a real space has. So basically anything that you say is going to immediately be important by proxy.
Yeah.
And even if it's not, it will become that. Like, an anecdote is from a session a friend of mine ran, where there was a room and it had a bed in it. And that was the only thing in the room.
Yeah.
And that bed became like a 20-minute scene where people were like really wary about it. They were like doing all sorts of investigation roles, and finally somebody like just went, screw it, and lay on the bed. And the response from the GM was, really comfy bed. There was nothing to it. There was no plot. There was nothing hidden about it. It was just a bed. But because he'd said it was there, it was a huge deal suddenly.
Yeah, you can. It's so good. My friend ran a horror one shot in Dungeons and Dragons, and there was a point where like we had to be essentially shut ourselves in this house. We had boarded it up because there was like something nefarious outside, and he was narrating the entryway and said there are these two large rusted metal statues on either side of the door holding what looks like a flagpole or something like that. And immediately we're all like, these fucking things are coming alive. We have to deal with them right now. And later he told me, he was like, I just did that because I thought it was spooky.
Yeah. And it's a really tough problem to get over. And to be honest, I don't really think that we entirely succeeded in getting over that hump in Locus. I mean, one of the major things that we have had to do really is in the player guide, we just outright said you can just do things. Combat is usually like fighting the thing is usually not your best option.
Yeah.
And we just outright said it because there's not really much we can do from a design point of view in a lot of ways to really cement that lack of focus on it.
Yeah.
More than we've already done. And a lot of the reactions where we've had people who run in and try to fight things has essentially been a cultural one. Where that's just what they're used to doing in TTRPGs. And like, yeah, fair enough. And the best we can do in a lot of ways without outright removing combat from the game, which we didn't want to do, is to do a few things. Like, there's quite a lot in the director's guide about it, to be fair, about how to guide that experience and how to make things scary without making them immediately lethal. Because one problem that you have in a lot of these situations is someone will run in to fight a thing and it could turn around and blast them. And what you don't want is someone's character just getting immediately just murked and removed from the game because they didn't quite read the situation right.
Right.
And that was actually a big thing with the whole of the design of Locus was a lot of it's about consequences. It's about dealing with consequences, and we wanted players to feel the consequences of the character's actions.
Because in a way, if your character is immediately taken out of the game because of a mistake, or like you said, not reading a situation quite correctly, you're almost in a way removing consequence from the game, because then they don't have to deal with the fallout of whatever actions that they take.
Yeah, basically. Exactly that. I think that there's a lot to be said for the fact that D&D very often becomes a comedy game. And that's not an indictment on D&D. Like, lots of people have a lot of fun with that, and great.
Yeah.
But it often becomes a comedy game, partly because you can't rely on your character to successfully do stuff that they're good at.
Yeah.
Because that's the nature of a single D20, where even like the best people, at least at low levels, probably only have like a +5.
Mm-hmm.
And like that just makes every dice roll a random crapshoot. And it's really difficult to go into that and not have it kind of become a bit farce, or at least have people react to it by drawing away a little bit from the stakes of stuff.
Yeah. It becomes a little farcical in some ways, because like one of my first characters I ever rolled when I just started into the TTRPG space, I was like, the person's name was Roland, and he was somebody who was dealing with deaths in his family that were caused by this sort of ethereal being. And I was kind of going for tragic backstory, all this stuff, but he had dedicated himself to try to make sure that this never happened to anyone else, even if that was standing up against like the incarnation of death. And one of the first rolls I ever made was I saw some danger coming to this town that we were in. I stood up on this cart, like I started yelling and screaming and saying, like, everybody, like there's something coming. Everyone get out of the street. Something bad is coming. We need to make sure everyone's safe. And I rolled so poorly that essentially I fell off the cart into mud and was like, blah, 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 blah. And everyone's like, oh, a crazy person, or like someone that is not, we do not have to pay attention to. And it became, a gag. Like that was the whole thing, was that I kept rolling really low on these very vital sort of social checks. And so it just became that my character was just this oaf that thought that he was like not taken seriously, but also was making all of these horrible decisions. And so it kind of became farcical instead, like you were saying, because of the mechanics.
Yeah. And obviously we don't want that for Locus.
Well, we've kind of gone across a lot of different topics now, but I want to get to maybe the most important thing, which is what you are working on. So tell me a little bit about Cobblepath Games.
We're a 2-person studio. I'm full-time doing Cobblepath, and Steph is part-time doing Cobblepath. She actually has a job like a proper person. And so we basically are interested in making tabletop games that fit sort of... We like to design to themes. So we like to design our games so they're specifically kind of built to do a certain thing, rather than being kind of generalist games.
Sure. Like the Locus kind of specializing in sort of horror, but also kind of a specific genre of horror as well.
Yeah. And it's very much built to do what it's built to do. It doesn't really function too much outside of that. Because we haven't built it to function outside of that. And that's kind of our kind of oeuvre, but we're pretty diverse with what we're doing.
Yeah, and you're also an award-winning studio. Can you tell us a little bit about the game that won such a prestigious award?
Yeah, well, so yes, Stacks of Goblins, which is our second full game, won a Judges Award at the Ennies, Judges' Choice Award. And
since you kind of like focus in as a studio on making very specific experience, what were you guys kind of going for Stack of Goblins?
So Stacks of Goblins is about being one of several goblins in a trench coat, and the goblin ruler has sent you out to get things as tribute, because that's what you do as a goblin for your goblin ruler. But none of you were really listening, so you've all got different ideas of what you need to get.
Yeah.
And basically, it's just a semi-co-op, semi-non-co-op, GM-less goblin chaos game, I guess.
I think the genre of goblin chaos is super underrepresented too, so this was great.
One thing that surprised me, and is a really good case study for how you should do your research. Not you specifically, but anybody making stuff. Do your research, kids. I discovered after we'd made it that it is merely one of many entries into the thriving subgenre of low-level D&D enemies stacked on top of each other in a trench coat RPGs. There's a lot of them. Like a surprising amount. Type in goblins in a trench coat into itch.
I don't know. I love how creative people are. It just brings me so much joy that this is like its own niche genre.
We're actually working on this isn't the game that we're fully currently working on, but one of our future projects that we're sort of starting to lay the groundwork for is a spin-off from Stacks of Goblins.
Yeah.
That's going to be very different. I don't think I can... You're going to be the first to hear about this, so like expose that.
Big news dropping on tabletop.
Yeah. We're making a Stacks of Goblins spin-off where you play a bunch of goblins who have been sent to win the top prize in a Takeshi's Castle style game show.
Nice. I love that. That's going to be very fun. Is it I guess a sequel game? Like, are you playing as the same group of goblins, or is this just like a rival group that is completely different?
You're theoretically, at least in vanilla, going to be playing as a group of goblins under the same goblin ruler. Whether you're specifically the same set of goblins that was in the trench coat, maybe you are, maybe you're not. It's going to have a bit more kind of variation in what you can play, because it's going to have like actual classes.
This goblin ruler has a very niche like request system.
It's just the goblin ruler's favorite TV show, and they realised that they want the trophy, so they just sent a load of their people out to get it.
Amazing. So that's not the only thing you guys are working on. In fact, you have another game coming out called Coffee and Chaos that is, we've talked about it a little bit before off mic, and I personally am so excited for this game because it kind of brings everything I love about sort of like an anime style like onsen episode or like the beach episode or something, where it's just like characters in a one-off doing something funny or silly, and it's just like I can't wait to use this in all of my campaigns. So can you tell us a little bit about it, and then we'll kind of get into some details after?
Yeah, sure. So Coffee and Chaos is a comedy holiday game where you don't have to, but it's designed so that you can take your characters from other games with all of their powers and abilities and play a GM-less game for a session where they're all failing miserably at running a cafe.
It's sort of like the Coffee AU fan fiction episode.
Basically, yes.
That's so amazing. I love that idea.
It's really designed, and it really works very well when you bring characters in. But it's also
one way you described it to me before as well was like it's a game where these like superhero type people come into a game in which none of their powers will help them.
Yeah. You can use them. Absolutely, you can use them. It's just that they probably will just make things worse.
I cast Fireball to heat the coffee. Oh no!
Pretty much it's a game that's built around storytelling. It's very much not a game to win. It's a game about like essentially telling a sitcom episode.
Sure.
Things will go wrong. That's fine. That's the point. You don't win at Coffee and Chaos. It's just funny, and you get to explore how characters bounce off each other in a completely different situation.
Right.
So basically everything, to boil how it works right down, pretty much any action has a 50-50 chance of succeeding or not.
And how do you get that sort of variance, I guess, of a coin flip? Is it just like what mechanic, I guess, did you put in to really try to zone in on that sort of like you're going to fail a bunch, but you're also going to laugh a lot. And then there's a bunch of successes too, because it's 50-50.
So if you want to get super precise, it's technically not 50-50 because it's using a deck of cards.
Gotcha.
And decks of cards have quite complex probabilities because when you use a card, it's not in the deck anymore.
Right.
But to boil it really simply down, you expect it to be about 50-50, which is essentially because the way it works is every action you do takes one of 3 approaches. And those
Yes, you were telling me about this earlier, and I love the way that you frame this in the game as well, because it's so thematic.
So it's you can take a direct approach, you can take a creative approach, or you can take a thought-out approach, and those are represented by different cutlery. So a direct approach is a knife, a creative approach is a fork, and a thought-out approach is a spoon, and they essentially are a rock, paper, scissors triangle. So direct approaches beat creative, creative approaches beat thought-out, and thought-out beat direct. And each of them is linked to a card suit as well.
Nice.
So when you play one, when you do an action to try, so when you use Fireball to try and heat that coffee up, you take a thing. Now, let's be honest, that's a direct approach. You're going to be spending a
right.
Well, it could be a creative approach, depending on the character and the flavour of the action, actually.
Or the very specific situation, I guess.
Yeah. But let's say it's a direct one, because it's a pretty direct one. So you spend a knife. Now, knives beat fork, and forks are represented by clubs. So you flip a card to find out whether you succeed or not. And basically, if you get a club, you succeed because your knife beats fork. And if you get a heart, you succeed because hearts are always a success.
Okay, so there you go. So basically, you're always playing with 2 suits of the deck going to be a success and 2 suits going to be a failure.
Yes,
that's very clever. Very well done.
It's quite smooth in play, and it means that there is some interaction between you and the random thing. Because, if you picked a different way to do your action, that card flip could mean a different result.
And also depending on the character, too, because do you have characters that would just all be knives, or would you have all characters have a full suite of cutlery?
So every character has a learned approach and a innate approach. And the natural approach is what they typically would do. So, for example, my LARP character, Capra, who's a goat beastkin who's been half turned into a magical construct and is very good at smashing things, but not very good at anything else. Her natural approach would be a direct approach. And she has learned over her short time being around to do some creative approaches as well. So she'd have a knife as her natural approach and a fork as her learned approach. What that means is she starts the game with a fork, and her natural approach means that she can always turn any cutlery into a knife.
Gotcha.
And then in addition to those, which are what she has, there's a pool for the whole group that's based on the cafe that you build.
Okay. So if it's like, so it's the name, or is there like a theme of your cafe, or is that just flavor and it kind of follows the same thing?
You score it on 3 scales between big and small, slick and scrappy, and fresh and cozy.
Amazing.
Depending on how you score them in those scales depends on what the cutlery in the sort of group pool looks like at the start of the game.
I can't tell you how much I'm excited for like my friends home game that I'm part of. Like, I can't wait for our group to open some shabby cat cafe and try to make it run. It's going to be so good.
The first time we tested it, we did it with our superhero, our Mutants and Masterminds characters.
Yeah.
And we opened a coffee shop that the first card flip of the day had the coffee machine break and has failed to fix it, so we rebranded as a juice bar immediately.
That's a creative solution.
With my character trying to sell the juice bar to the delivery driver and failing.
Be like, please take this off our hands. We don't know how to run a coffee shop / juice bar. It's so good. It's such a great idea, and it's gonna be perfect for like actual plays and for a lot of like game folks who are like switching systems or in between story arcs or in between campaigns. Even like I could see this being like a very fun epilogue to a campaign as well.
Yeah. It's also quite nice if like someone can't make it, or if your GM's had a really hard week and doesn't have time to put a game together.
Yeah, because it's GM-less too, right? It's like just amazing.
One of the fun things we've had is one of the fun things we've done when we played it is we often have antagonists. Like the GM will play some antagonist that's their favorite.
Yeah.
So you'll have like the group of heroes, and then the big bad is also with them.
Being like, hey, you guys beat me, so I have to find a job. And this juice bar seemed pretty cool, so
like this any more than you do, but we're all stuck here for the day.
Amazing. I think that this is going to be such a fun just experience. I can't wait to get my hands on it. So when and how can people get their hands on it, I guess?
So at the moment, I believe you can Slacker-backer it on its GameFound page, which means that you can essentially pre-order it for when it's done. We've had a few delays with the production because of illness on multiple different places, but at the moment it's with our layout artist,
amazing,
Kat, and they are doing the layout for the main menu and for the table talker that it will be on. So the game is printed on a menu, and the situations that relate to the card flips are printed on the table talker, which is those little triangle things that you get in restaurants.
Yeah.
So that's going to be the main game, and then we've got a few more graphics to do once we've got those back to make sure they're all in line for a lot of the Kickstarter. Well, the game found the crowdfund goodies like the mug and the stickers and things. And then
amazing, and
hopefully we'll get it back pretty soon.
Yeah, and you can find these links, by the way, to our wonderful audience in the show notes. So if you want to back it and to essentially pre-order this amazing game, which I will definitely be doing, just head to the show notes and there'll be a link there as well.
Yeah. At the moment, the plan is that for at least a little while, that the GameFound is the best place to get a physical copy of the game. But if you're interested in the digital copy, it will be up on our itch once we've sent the digital versions to our backers.
That's so cool. And you've already kind of hinted of a soon to be in production game of Goblin game shows. So that's amazing. But is there anything that you're kind of excited to do in the new year for the studio? Are you guys going to be producing a bunch of games? Do you have anything else in the works that you want to tell the fine people about?
Yeah. So one that we've announced that we've done a bit more work on, and is probably going to be our next release after Coffee and Chaos, is Locus Insight, which is a solo journaling game.
Okay.
That acts as a prequel to a Locus story.
Oh, that's so cool.
The idea is that the director can sit down with Locus Insight, play through it, and then they'll have the majority of what they need to run a Locus story.
Oh, that's so cool.
But also that it will be like an interesting solo game on its own. So we'll see how well.
Yeah, one of our co-hosts has been using a solo TTRPG to inspire world building for the games that he runs. Very interesting. I'm like, I have never kind of interfaced with a solo TTRPG before, but I'm excited to try soon. I think that it's time.
Yeah, there's quite a few really interesting world building solo games out there. But as far as I'm aware, this is the only one that's directly built to feed into a specific game. And credit to Steph for that idea. It was not mine, it was hers, and it's amazing. Probably the best idea either of us have ever had, frankly. I think it's really cool. So
yeah, no, definitely. It sounds amazing. And also, like, I can't wait for the if you continue doing these for other games as well, for the one where it's the Goblin Lord deciding what he's all about.
I'm not sure how much that would work, given that in a lot of ways it already is that game.
Yeah, right.
We are doing some weird stuff, like the Takeshi's Castle one.
Yep.
Is going to be like a mashup between board game and role playing game.
Mm-hmm.
So we're planning to print it on like books that lay flat.
Yeah.
Like lay flat photo books, and have it as like they're the boards, and there's like different games that you can flip through the book, and they all have boards in the game. In the book, hopefully, it's how we're kind of envisioning it, but we haven't really fleshed that one out yet.
That's also very cool.
We're
yeah.
hoping to get the LARP we've designed rolling.
Nice. And is that a within the same publisher, or would that be a different publisher?
It's going to be Cobblepath, but there's a chance it might be like a subsidiary of Cobblepath.
Interesting. And if people want to like kind of keep up with what's going on with Cobblepath and your work developing and your partner's work developing, where can people kind of do that? What's the best way to keep up with all of the releases and ideas and brilliance that you guys are bringing to the TTRPG market?
So the simplest way is to follow us on Itch.
Okay.
And the Itch store should be in the links. That's the simplest way. There's also on our website, which will also be in the links, which is cobblepathgames.co.uk, has a mailing list you can sign up to. That has fairly sporadic but really important news. That's where the really important stuff comes out.
Cool.
We also have Twitters. So there's the Cobblepath Twitter, which is @Cobblepath, and there's my Twitter, which is @Cobblesprite. Steph also has a Twitter at Obscurey, but she doesn't use it that much.
She's the best of us.
Yes, she is. Oh, definitely. And they're healthier.
Yeah.
But Cobblepath, if you only want news about the studio, Cobblepath's the one to follow. If you want to hear musings about games, arguments with people, retweeting about how terrible the government in the UK is, things like that, then you can follow me as well.
Amazing. And I highly suggest everyone does, because I have had a fantastic conversation with you, Ferne. This has been a true pleasure, but I think everyone definitely needs to keep up with all of your kind of insane shenanigans in the TTRPG market. I think that we're going to see a lot of really fun things for you coming in the future.
I sure hope so, and thank you so much for having me on.
Of course, and the door is always welcome. It's always, let me say that again. The door is always open for you to come back whenever you guys have another game that you're releasing, or just some new interesting things to talk about. We all have loved talking to you here at Tabletop.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Hey, I'm Brando.
And I'm Owen.
And we're the hosts of Banter and Such.
Each week we get together with the most interesting people that we know and talk about the things that we're generally interested in.
Like movies.
TV shows.
Movies.
Nostalgic childhood franchises.
Movies.
Urban legends.
And sometimes movies.
So check out Banter and Such anywhere you get podcasts.
Banter, ampersand, such.
Or banter and then the word and then such.
Or just banter and it fills in the rest automatically for you and you just click on it.
Either way, it's called Banter and Such.
Want to get into some BS with us?